Being buried alive has to be one of the worst fates that can happen to you. Slowly running out of air as you desperately try to break your way out of a sturdy coffin, all the while unable to see anything. Although the stuff of nightmares, being buried alive might be more common than you think. Before the rise of modern medicine, methods of determining death were far from reliable, and in 1896, an American funeral director reported that nearly 2% of bodies which were buried and then later exhumed showed signs that the person may have actually been alive when they were buried. Even today, people are still mistakenly being pronounced dead and then buried alive. Here are my choices for 5 true stories of people being buried alive. Number 5. Macy Perez. 16-year-old Macy Perez from Honduras fell unconscious after walking in the night to use the bathroom. According to reports, the girl was 3 months pregnant and may have suffered a severe panic attack after hearing gunfire near her house, resulting in her collapsing and losing consciousness. She was found by her parents foaming at the mouth as a result of her injuries, and in a strange twist to the story, her parents first called in a local priest as they believed that she had been possessed by an evil spirit. After the priest's attempt at an exorcism failed, the parents then rushed her to the local hospital. 3 hours later, the 16-year-old was pronounced dead. Her devastated family organised her funeral and arranged to have her buried in her wedding dress, as she had only recently been married. A day after the funeral, her grieving husband was visiting her grave when he claimed to have heard banging and screams for help emanating from the girl's concrete tomb. Her husband quickly raised the alarm, and a large crowd gathered and attempted to break open the concrete tomb with a sledgehammer. After eventually breaking through, the coffin was opened, and desperate attempts were made to revive her. The glass viewing window on her coffin had been smashed, her fingertips were covered in bruises, and she had scratches on her forehead. It appeared as though she had indeed awoken inside her coffin and attempted to break out. Witnesses claimed to have touched her and felt that her body was still warm, as well as feeling a faint heartbeat. Her body was rushed to the nearest hospital, where doctors attempted to resuscitate her. Unfortunately, their attempts were in vain, and she was pronounced dead for a second time. She was then taken back to the cemetery and reburied in the same tomb that was smashed open just hours before. So how could this tragedy have happened? Doctors believe that the panic attack the girl suffered may have temporarily stopped her heart, only for her to awaken after she had been buried. Inside the coffin, she would have most likely eventually suffocated due to a lack of oxygen. Another theory is that she may have had a cataplexy attack, which is a temporary loss of muscle function and is usually triggered by extreme stress or fear. Disturbingly, victims of cataplexy maintain full conscious awareness, so if this was indeed what she had been struck down with, she would have been fully aware while being buried alive. Number 4. Mary Best. 17-year-old Mary Best contracted cholera while living in India in 1871. After hours of suffering the terrible symptoms of the disease, she gradually faded away until her heartbeat could no longer be detected, and the doctor pronounced her dead. Just hours after being pronounced dead, she was buried in the vault of her adopted family in the French cemetery in Calcutta. At this time, it was not unusual to bury cholera victims so quickly, as doctors were keen to limit the possibility of germs spreading. Combined with the oppressive heat of the Indian weather, her rapid burial did not seem out of place. Mary was soon forgotten. However, 10 years later, the vault was opened to inter the body of her recently deceased uncle. The undertaker was shocked to find the lid of Mary's coffin, which had been securely nailed down after her burial, knocked onto the floor. The skeletal remains of Mary were half in and half out of the coffin, and her skull had received a massive fracture. Upon closer inspection, her fingers could be seen bent as if she had been clutching at something, perhaps her own throat, and her clothes were torn. It appeared as though Mary had not been dead when she was sealed in her coffin, but simply unconscious. Cholera victims would often slip into comas, and it was in this state that she had mistakenly been pronounced dead. She would have likely awoken a few hours later to be met with the horrifying realization that she had already been buried. From the position and condition of her remains, it seems as though she desperately fought to force off the lid of her coffin, and upon doing so, maybe accidentally lunged forward from the force of her pushing, only to smash her head on the stone shelf above her. Such an injury would have likely killed her instantly. However, a darker theory is that she may have opened the coffin without hurting herself, only to eventually go mad with despair, alone in the darkness, scratching at her clothing. Realizing that she had no way to escape, she may have tried to strangle herself, which explains the position of her hands, before eventually ending her life by choice, banging her head against the hard stone above her. In a cruel twist to the story, it was later revealed that the doctor who signed her death certificate may have been responsible for her fate. He had twice tried to kill her adopted mother, perhaps in some attempt to steal her money, and it's thought that Mary may have somehow uncovered evidence against him. the doctor may have knowingly had Mary buried alive in order to rid himself of the problem. Number 3. Angelo Hays. In 1937, 19-year-old Angelo Hays was involved in a life-changing motorbike accident. Travelling at high speed, he was thrown headfirst from his bike into a nearby brick wall. Doctors examined his body and were unable to find a pulse, so Angelo was pronounced dead. His facial injuries from the crash were so terrible that his parents were not allowed to view his body. After 3 days at the local morgue, his body was buried. That seemed to be the end of his story. However, just days before his accident, an insurance policy had been taken out on his life by his parents. This raised understandable suspicion, and the insurance investigators demanded that his body be exhumed for closer examination, as they wanted to look for signs of foul play. 2 days after his burial, Angelo's body was exhumed and examined. To the shock of the doctors, despite supposedly being dead for 5 days, his body was still warm. Closer examination revealed that his heart was still beating, albeit faintly, and the 19-year-old was still very much alive. He had simply fallen into a coma as a result of his accident, and due to the medical examiner at the time being unable to locate a heartbeat, he had been mistakenly pronounced dead. He was rushed to the hospital, and after multiple surgeries to repair his injuries, he eventually recovered completely. It was theorized that he had managed to survive being buried alive for 2 days, thanks to his head injury and coma. In this state, his body no longer required as much oxygen for survival, and thus he was able to stay alive without suffocating. Due to this incredible brush with death, Angelo became somewhat of a celebrity in France, and years later he went on to invent a security coffin. This strange contraption was designed to prevent others from being buried alive, and contained a food locker, alarm bell, oxygen supply, and even a chemical toilet. Number 2. Stephen Small. Stephen Small was the heir of a wealthy publishing family who received a strange phone call on September 2nd, 1987. The person calling claimed to be a police officer and told Mr. Small that another property he owned had been burgled. Stephen left his house to investigate, and 2 hours later, his wife received a phone call from someone demanding a $1 million ransom. The burglary story had been just a ruse, and her husband had been kidnapped. His wife was told to gather the cash, and not to alert the authorities. Mrs. Small did alert the police, however, and her phone line was immediately tapped so that police could trace incoming calls. More calls were received to arrange the ransom drop-off, and this led police to eventually track down the kidnappers, Danny Edwards and Nancy Risch. Stephen Small was eventually found buried 1 meter underground, inside a wooden box, which measured just 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. The box contained a light connected to a battery, a jug of water, some candy, and a flashlight. A breathing tube had also been fitted inside the box, however the tube was too long and thus did not give Mr. Small the air he would have needed. Unfortunately, because of this, he did not survive the ordeal and had suffocated by the time his body was discovered. Medical examiners later estimated that he would have likely had enough oxygen to survive for around 4 hours in the makeshift coffin. His kidnappers were eventually convicted, however there is still some debate over whether they intended for him to survive the abduction or whether they had planned to kill him all along. Number 1. Essie Dunbar. After suffering a severe epileptic attack in 1915, 30-year-old Essie Dunbar was pronounced dead after no signs of life were found when her local doctor examined her. Her friends and family made plans for her funeral, which was to be held the next day to give her sister who lived in another town time to travel so that she could attend. On the day of the funeral, a lengthy service was held, however Essie's sister had not yet arrived. Unable to delay the proceedings any longer, the coffin was lowered into the grave and buried. As everybody was preparing to leave, Essie's sister finally arrived. She was furious at having missed the ceremony and demanded that she be allowed one last chance to see Essie. Reluctantly, the ministers arranged to have the coffin dug up and the lid was removed. As soon as the coffin had been opened, Essie sat up and smiled at her sister. The mourners fled in terror, and the 3 ministers fell backwards in shock, falling into the open grave that had been dug behind them, with one of the men suffering 3 broken ribs. Essie climbed out of her coffin and pursued her friends and family into town, all the while trying to convince them that she was not a ghost or a zombie. It had transpired that the doctor had mistakenly declared her dead after being unable to find a pulse, when in fact she was just unconscious after the epileptic attack. Essie lived for a further 47 years, however had her sister been on time for the funeral, she would have likely suffered a much more disturbing fate. So those are my choices for 5 real-life buried alive stories. After reading about all of these people being buried alive, I'm definitely requesting to be cremated. So thanks for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you again on the next video.